When Professor Harris began his lecture that morning, he had no idea that one of his students would soon turn the tables on him in a way that left the entire room in stunned silence. The university classroom was filled with students, some half paying attention, others scrolling through their phones, but all unaware of the moment that was about to unfold. Harris, a well-known political science professor, had a reputation for being outspoken, often incorporating his personal opinions into his lectures. That day, the topic drifted toward media portrayal of public figures, and soon he set his sights on former First Lady Melania Trump. With a smirk, he casually remarked, "Melania Trump, proof that a modeling career and a rich husband can take you places education never will." A few students chuckled nervously, others exchanged glances, but one student, sitting quietly at the back of the room, wasn't amused. That student was Barron Trump. He had always kept a low profile at school, avoiding unnecessary attention. But this was different. This wasn't just a joke. It was an insult to his mother, spoken in front of a crowd that had no idea who he really was. Barron leaned forward slightly, his face calm, but his voice steady as he spoke. "Professor, would you say that about any other woman who built a career for herself, or just my mother?" A hush fell over the room. The students who had been half listening were suddenly all ears. Harris, caught off guard, shifted in place. He hadn't expected pushback, certainly not from someone like Barron, who rarely spoke in class. "Well," Harris hesitated, "public figures are open to criticism. It's just an observation." Barron didn't let him off the hook that easily. An observation or an insult? Because if we're talking about education, my mother speaks 5 languages fluently, has worked internationally, and was successful before she ever met my father. Can you say the same? A few students stifled gasps. Someone murmured, "Damn." Professor Harris, clearly flustered, tried to regain control. I wasn't trying to demean her intelligence. I was making a broader point about—" Barron interrupted, his voice still composed. "A broader point that wouldn't have been made if she weren't associated with my father. If she had married someone else, she'd be praised for her accomplishments. Instead, she's mocked. What does that say about the biases we hold?" The silence in the room was deafening. A few students nodded in agreement. Harris, struggling for a response, glanced around the room but found no support. Finally, he cleared his throat. "Point taken." Barron didn't say anything else. He leaned back in his chair, his point made. The class moved on, but the atmosphere had shifted. Everyone had witnessed something rare, a professor, so used to controlling the conversation, being challenged by a student in a way he couldn't dismiss. And from that day forward, Harris never made another joke about Melania Trump again. As the lecture continued, an unmistakable tension lingered in the air. Some students stole glances at Barron, as if seeing him for the first time. He had always been polite, reserved, never drawing attention to himself. But in that moment, he had commanded the room, not with anger, not with arrogance, but with sheer confidence and fact. Professor Harris, now visibly uneasy, tried to regain control of the discussion. "All right, let's move on," he said, flipping through his notes. "Let's discuss how media influences public perception of leaders and their families." But it was too late. The moment had already become the most memorable part of the lecture. Some students, inspired by Barron's calm yet firm rebuttal, had a newfound respect for him. Others, who had laughed along with the professor just minutes ago, now felt embarrassed. As class ended and students gathered their belongings, a few approached Barron. One of them, a girl named Emily, smiled. "That was impressive. You handled that really well." Barron simply nodded. "I just don't like when people make unfair assumptions." Another student, Jake, chimed in. "I've never really thought about it that way. It's crazy how people treat your mom differently just because of who she married." Barron gave a small shrug. "It happens all the time. But it's not just about my mom. People do it to anyone they think they can ridicule without consequences." As they walked out of the lecture hall, Professor Harris remained seated at his desk, staring at his notes but clearly lost in thought. He had always considered himself intellectually superior, a figure who could challenge ideas without fear of resistance. Yet today, a student, one he had underestimated, had forced him to confront his own bias in front of an entire class. By the time Barron reached the hallway, his phone buzzed. A message from his father. Somehow, the exchange had already reached. Him and Donald Trump. Proud of you, son. Never let them walk over you. Barron smiled slightly. He had spoken up not for praise, but because it was the right thing to do. Yet knowing his father recognized and respected his stance made it even more meaningful. Over the next few days, word of the confrontation spread across campus. People who had never spoken to Barron before suddenly wanted to hear his thoughts. Some professors, aware of what had happened, were more cautious with their words. And Professor Harris? He never directly addressed the incident, but students noticed a shift. His lectures became more balanced, less filled with personal bias. One moment of courage had changed the dynamics of the classroom. And for Barron, it was a reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stand your ground and speak the truth. A few days later, Barron walked into class as usual, his expression unreadable. He had no intention of making a big deal out of what had happened. To him, it was over. But for many students, the moment still lingered in their minds. Conversations, in the hallways at the campus cafe, and even on social media revolved around how he had calmly yet powerfully shut down the professor's attempt at mockery. As he took his seat, he noticed something unusual. Professor Harris seemed different. Normally, he walked in with an air of superiority, a subtle smirk that hinted at his confidence in controlling the discussion. But today, there was hesitation in his step. His usual casual arrogance had been replaced by something else. Self-awareness. Clearing his throat, the professor began. Before we start today's lecture, I want to take a moment to acknowledge something. Last class, I made a remark that, in hindsight, was unfair and unnecessary. I've always encouraged debate and critical thinking in my classroom, and it seems I failed to hold myself to the same standard. The students sat in stunned silence. This was not the Professor Harris they knew. He wasn't the type to admit fault, let alone in front of an entire class. He turned toward Barron. I want to thank Mr. Trump for calling that out. It was a reminder that even those of us who teach have our own biases, and we should be more careful about how we express them. Barron simply nodded. He didn't need an apology, but he respected that Harris had chosen to acknowledge his mistake. For the rest of the class, the discussion was more thoughtful, more balanced. It was no longer just about media influence, but about how preconceived notions shape our perspectives. Students who had previously been passive listeners now engaged more actively, asking questions, challenging ideas, thinking critically. As class ended, Professor Harris caught Barron on his way out. You know, he said, I had you all wrong. You're sharper than I gave you credit for. Barron smiled slightly. Most people do. Harris let out a small chuckle. I suppose that's true. I'll keep that in mind. From that day forward, the class dynamic changed. Barron's presence was no longer overlooked. His classmates saw him not just as the son of a former president, but as an intelligent, articulate individual who wasn't afraid to stand his ground. And, though he never sought attention, one thing became clear. Barron Trump had just earned the quiet respect of an entire university. In the days that followed, Barron noticed subtle shifts in how people interacted with him on campus. Students who had once seen him as just a political figure's son now viewed him as someone with his own voice, his own thoughts. Professors, even those who had been skeptical of his presence at the university, seemed to approach discussions with a newfound respect. It wasn't just about what had happened with Professor Harris. It was about what it represented. A young man, often dismissed because of his last name, had turned the tables in a way no one had expected. One afternoon, as Barron sat at a campus cafe sipping his coffee and reviewing notes, a student he barely knew, a sophomore named Ryan, approached him. Hey man, Ryan said hesitantly. I just wanted to say, That was awesome, what you did in class. A lot of us feel like professors push their opinions on us, and we don't always know how to push back. You did it without being rude, without losing your cool. Barron nodded. Thanks. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong. I just don't think people should get a free pass for disrespecting others, especially when they're supposed to be setting an example. Ryan smiled. Yeah, exactly. You know, I've had Harris for another class before, and I've never seen him act like that. You actually got him to reflect on his words. Barron smirked. That's rare for a professor. Ryan laughed, then hesitated before adding, You should talk more in class, man. You've got good points. Barron shrugged. Maybe, if it's worth saying. That conversation was just one of many. In the following weeks, classmates started engaging Barron more, not just about politics, but about everything. Sports, philosophy, business. They weren't just interested in his last name anymore, they were interested in him. One day, after a particularly engaging debate in class, Professor Harris caught Barron as he was packing up his things. You know, Mr. Trump, he said, I've had students challenge me before, but not like that. Not with composure, not with facts. I respect that. Barron nodded. Appreciate it. Harris gave a small smile. You're going to do well. Here. And beyond. Barron didn't need validation, but he acknowledged the gesture. He knew that respect wasn't something given, it was earned. And in just one moment of standing up for what was right, he had done exactly that. As he walked across campus, the sun setting behind the grand university buildings, Barron felt something shift within him. He had spent most of his life in the EI, shadow of his last name. But for the first time, people were seeing him for who he truly was. And this was just the beginning. Barron Trump's moment in the classroom had done more than just silence a professor. It had set off a ripple effect, one that extended far beyond the lecture hall. What had started as an offhand remark meant to demean his mother had turned into a defining moment, not just for Barron, but for everyone who had witnessed it. The incident revealed something deeper about society's tendency to judge based on bias rather than facts. Melania Trump, like many women in the public eye, had been subjected to ridicule and assumptions simply because of her association with a political figure. Yet when confronted with undeniable facts, her multilingual abilities, her successful career before marrying Donald Trump, the room had no choice but to reconsider. For Barron, this wasn't about politics. It wasn't even about defending his mother out of obligation. It was about fairness, respect. The idea that no one, regardless of their background, family name, or status, should be treated as less than they are simply because of perception. His response had been measured, thoughtful, and powerful. And that was what had left the room in silence. Not because he had shouted or demanded an apology, but because he had exposed an uncomfortable truth in the most effective way possible, through calm reasoning and undeniable logic. Over the weeks that followed, Barron continued his studies as usual, never drawing attention to himself. But something had changed. Professors engaged with him differently. Classmates saw him as more than just a last name. Conversations became more thoughtful. People started questioning their own biases, wondering how often they had dismissed someone based on assumptions rather than reality. The lesson extended beyond the walls of that university. It was a reminder of the power of standing up, not with aggression, but with intelligence. It showed that true strength isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It's about being the one that people can't ignore because the truth is undeniable. Barron had proven something important that day, that respect isn't inherited, it's earned. And he had earned it, not because of who his father was, but because of who he had chosen to be in that moment. And perhaps in a world where opinions often overshadow facts, where quick judgments are made without deeper understanding, that was the most powerful statement of all.